Okay, looks like we've got a fairly large number of people already joined in. There's a few people still joining. So first of all, as I said, I'm Simon Pearson. I lead the digital team in the Energy Systems Catapult, and I'd like to welcome everybody today to what is in fact the third in a series of events we've been running this week, focused on the opportunities and challenges associated with digitalisation of the energy system, which is our primary area of focus at the moment. I think everybody knows that digitalisation is critical for the transformation of the energy system if we are to stand any viable chance of meeting our 2050 net zero obligations and targets. And each day this week we've been exploring a different aspect of digitalisation and where the particular disciplines and technologies and solutions might be able to support that transformation, and in some cases perhaps where they don't. So today's session is focused specifically around digital twins. Digital twins, it's a term that's used and abused quite frequently. So hopefully some of the things we'll come out with today will provide some context for what we refer to as digital twin when we're talking about it here, and it will talk about some of the opportunities and benefits that digital twins might provide as the system becomes. We know it's going to get more complex, more distributed, more interoperable. There's going to be increasingly intermittent sources of energy. So all of those things combined make life more complex. And we think digital twins does have a role to play in there, but it won't solve all problems. And hopefully some of those points will come out today, both in the presentations and the panel session afterwards. I hope you find the session today both informative and enjoyable. And hopefully you'll see the opportunity in the chat there to both raise questions and consider how you might get involved and engage with us going forwards as we look to do more stuff in this area. So with that, I'll hand over to Emily Ainsworth, who's been coordinating all of our recent efforts and work in the space of digital twins, and she'll lead us through the rest of the day. Over to you, Emily.
Great, thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Yeah, we're extremely excited about this and massively passionate about putting on these events to not only show what we're working on within the Catapult, but also to open the door for collaborative working. We all know that as we all reach towards a common goal of net zero, collaboration is so important, and especially with the topic of digital twins that we're going to cover today. We're really lucky to have put together a panel of some of the leading experts in the digital twin space, and we're really excited to open up the discussion later in the webinar into how digital twins are best placed within energy and how they can help us to achieve both dynamic, short-term clean energy goals, but also help us to plan, incentivise and create long-term decarbonisation pathways. So just to go over the agenda today, we're going to cover an introduction to what digital twins are and what they can do. We're going to go over the problems that they can solve. We're going to look at how to build a twin and the things that need to be incorporated to get a successful twin. We're going to cover some of the use cases that we went over in the Bayes feasibility report, and then we're going to discuss some of the next steps into how we can create hopefully successful twins with longevity within the energy system. So on the panel today, we are joined by John Berry, who is the Data and Digitalisation Manager from Western Power Distribution. We're also joined by Professor Chris Dent, who is a Professor of Industrial Mathematics at the University of Edinburgh, and Sarah Hayes, who is the Outreach Lead at the National Digital Twin Programme. So I'm going to hand over to Tabitha to share. We have a video testimonial from Alec from Bayes. So we hand over to Tabitha now.
Hello, my name's Alec Waterhouse, and I lead the Central Modelling Team in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. My colleagues and I use a comprehensive suite of models and data to help us understand our path to net zero. Most recently, we've used them to help us gain the confidence to accept the Committee on Climate Change's recommendation for the 6th carbon budget. We're now using them to help us develop our 6th carbon budget strategy. As we come out of this phase of analysis, my thoughts have been turning to the what next question. What modelling capability do we need in future? One of the issues that's coming to greater prominence is the interconnectedness of our current and future worlds, which is where digital twins are likely to come in. Last year, we ran a great symposium exploring the opportunities that a twin might provide. In principle, they will offer us the opportunity to use real-world data at much greater temporal and spatial resolution than we use now, and they would offer us the possibility of developing a one-stop shop to help us understand in the short and long term how decarbonisation options will work on the ground. And capability like that would be a great leap forward. The twin could help us understand longer term questions such as how hydrogen can be used effectively, the trade-off between heat networks and point sources, the role of long-term storage, and to help us identify where research and development will have the biggest payoff. And in the near term, it will help by providing consistent data sources and modelling solutions rather than the smorgasbord of solutions that we have now. So it could be used for strategy and planning, asset management and operations all in one place. And once we have a twin in place, it could be used to develop local area energy plans, explore the best way to reinforce and develop networks in the light of net zero, and a host of other things. However, as you well know, twins are near the top of the hype cycle. Or to put it another way, the answer's a twin. Now what's the question? And that's not the approach I think we should be taking. To date, twins have only really been developed to model individual assets or groups of assets, wind farms, distribution centres, and even Formula One cars. Developing anything like a twin for our energy system is, I think, several orders of magnitude harder. That's why I'm very interested in our work piloting the approach. The aim of the pilot is to test the state of the art, our data, software and modelling capabilities, to see whether we can develop a twin now or what we might need to have in place in order to develop one in the future. Now is a good time to test the case for developing a twin. We have more data, more computing power, more and greater modelling capabilities. The question is it enough? And that's the journey we're on. We have made some small steps in that direction, and I'm grateful to the Energy Systems Catapult and others for their work on writing their report on the next steps for piloting the twin. Finally, I'm pretty sure that developing a meaningful energy systems twin will need to be a collaborative exercise, that no one group will have all the resources required to develop one. So I'm really looking forward to the collaboration, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Cool. So I suppose the only natural place to start, and the main thing that we're pushing from within ESC, is defining what a digital twin actually is. So one of the biggest blockers to getting digital twin systems within a variety of sectors is that there is a bit of a grey area over what a twin actually is, especially when comparing that to two of the other technologies that are on its development roadmap. And for that reason, I'm going to be really careful to refer to digital twins as digital twins technologies or digital twin systems throughout this presentation, especially when discussing some of the use cases later on. So on the slide now are just some of the definitions of what digital twins are, and these are used throughout a variety of different industries, and they can vary from a digital twin being just a model to one in which it incorporates dynamic data flows. The really important thing to remember is that achieving each of these capabilities is equally as important as it is to achieve a full digital twin. And there are various circumstances where a digital model is actually way more beneficial than digital twin is. And we'll come to discuss some of these use cases later on. So the roadmap to a digital twin encompasses two other pieces of technology, a digital model and a digital shadow. So a digital model is one in which there is no data flow between the physical object and a virtual model. So an example of that could be a CAD drawing of a wind turbine, where it's beneficial for an engineer to be able to see the intricate parts of a wind turbine up close, often in 3D and preferably from a remote location, as opposed to at the turbine site. And this can make things like scheduling maintenance, replication of construction for these assets a lot easier. And it just means that you haven't got to send an engineer out to a often remote site to check on parts. Another example within energy is the digital replication of utility drawings. So until pretty recently, and it's still happening in some cases, infrastructure mapping has been carried out on paper, but organisations are now beginning to create digital maps of their infrastructure, which makes it easier to visualise where complex infrastructure are, and it can help identify when customers are going to likely to be affected by it in the case of any issues, or they can direct subcontractors to sites a lot easier. This obviously means there's savings in costs and time, and scheduling as well is a massive benefit of a digital model. A digital shadow is one in which can incorporate a one-way data flow between the physical object and a virtual model, and this can then be used to model outcomes and scenarios which the physical model may exhibit. A well-known, I suppose, frustrating example of this is the Rolls-Royce digital twin, which is actually a digital shadow and not a twin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a bit later on. A digital shadow is great because it can integrate a real-time information flow that is able to then advise engineers on when and where to make changes. So it can do things like identifying when faults may happen in the asset's life cycle, or displaying how a part of infrastructure may behave under certain external conditions. So a recent example is they did one for a bridge in Italy, where they were able to exhibit how the bridge may behave under maximal loads or high winds, but changes in real time can't happen. Either the technology isn't advanced enough yet, it doesn't exist, or there could be a risk to human life in doing so. So going back slightly to the Rolls-Royce example, I don't know about anybody else, but when I'm kind of mid-air on a jet engine, if there was an engineer back at base fiddling with the engine whilst we were mid-air, that'd be a little bit terrifying. So in that case, a shadow is amazing for those benefits, but a twin necessarily isn't appropriate at this point in time. So a digital twin is obviously the focus of today, and there is a system where there's a two-way data flow between the physical object and a digital model, and that can then allow for real-time changes in the physical system. A fully functioning digital twin is quite often seen as the be-all and end-all when discussing up-and-coming technologies, but in reality, as I mentioned earlier, it's the bits in the roadmap to this that can be equally as beneficial and shouldn't necessarily be seen as a failure, which is quite often the case. And currently, finding an example of these systems that fully exist within infrastructure is quite tricky. And again, this is mostly due to so many organizations being able to exhibit the benefits of a shadow system really, really well, but are then advertised as digital twins instead. And that means it's a massive grey area over what the systems actually are and their benefits case. So a digital twin has traditionally been seen as a virtual representation of a real world asset, quite often infrastructure focused, or a set of assets such as bridges, buildings, or wind turbines, but they can actually be considered as a complex system where each of these individual assets can be incorporated, and this is where their benefits case within energy begins to come in. Digital twins are able to provide a significant opportunity to support numerous aspects of the energy system's transition to net zero, and we've been carrying out a landscaping piece to see how these technologies could be applied to not only see the performance of infrastructure in real time, but to aid in the planning of new policies, encompass regulatory issues easier, predict maintenance, and ensure longevity of low carbon solutions. Over the last 12 months or so, at the Energy Systems Catapult, we've been working on a variety of digital twin technology projects that have provided a wide variety of benefits cases. We've worked with organisations through our Energy Launchpad service who have wanted help in building use cases on how their already advanced software could help to develop digital twin landscape within energy, and where the gaps lie to provide true benefits to the sector. We've also worked on the Dreams project, which looked to help apply digital twin technologies to a small area within the borough of Hounslow. And this was able to look into getting net zero housing by incorporating low carbon tech, such as heat pumps, solar panels, and things like smarter home management. So by using things like effective building management systems alongside modelling software, digital twins can be used to both optimise performance of homes in the real time, but can also begin to lay out pathways to help homes reach net zero. We've most recently completed this landscaping and feasibility piece with BASE, where we've investigated how a twin style system could be applied within energy to create long-term decarbonisation pathways. And this is where we need your help. So our aim is to develop a digital twin system, which doesn't just become another one of the numbers that already exist and adds to the growing problem of siloed workings within the energy sector. Whilst many of the energy sector focused digital twins focus on things such as remote monitoring and the operating of renewable assets, as these often exist in things like remote, hard to reach locations, our aim on the BASE project is to ensure that dynamic data sets from a range of different sources are able to be incorporated to give a more holistic view of the energy system, both at present and what it could look like going forward with various technologies applied. So the ability to successfully represent and model how energy systems will interact with each other and evolve over time is obviously key to enabling policymakers and operators to make changes that will make implementing low carbon tech much, much easier. But one of the key aspects of this process that will make it more cohesive and streamlined is the active push to share information between ecosystems. It is thought, or it's hoped, that once there is a reduction in the silos of data repositories throughout the energy industry, it should be easier to create holistic, whole system models that are able to fully visualize and conceptualize how the grid may behave. And so there really requires an emphasis to be put onto the key stakeholders to release this information. Obviously, in a perfect world, data sharing would be really straightforward and easy and without its challenges. But in reality, we have to ensure that both data users, data subjects, and the data owners are protected from any issues that may arise from the sharing of information. So alongside obviously trying to enable this amazing technology advanced digital twin piece, we need to ensure that there's a priority of capturing data sets and a priority to develop a governance framework in which the whole life cycle of data is considered, from the processing to the storing to the accessing of it. Data for a digital twin is most likely going to be dynamic, and so it is crucial that all data is coming in a uniform way that is in alignment with the data best practice principles and the Centre for Digital Britain's information management framework. And this is just to ensure that all of the models are accurate and have longevity going forward. There is also a requirement to include uncertainty-based modelling and scenario-based planning in order to enhance robustness and track trends within the energy sector. Digital twins haven't fully been utilised yet as trend capturing, and with the aim here to achieve net zero, this is obviously something that needs to become a priority pretty quickly. There needs to be a way in which we can monitor the impact of low carbon tech in the UK, and this needs to be visualised and tracked to either incentivise investors to increase their distribution, or quite often concentration within certain areas to ensure they can best plan future ventures. Obviously, the inherent nature of renewable tech is their unpredictability, and this is one of the main reasons for wanting to apply twin technologies within the energy sector to track their impact. So when it came to building our use cases, we constructed them in alignment with the Centre for Digital Britain's use case framework, which encompasses strategy and planning, managing assets, and assurance. And it was a pretty big priority for us to ensure that our works aligned with the works carried out by the National Digital Twin Programme, because as I mentioned earlier, the last thing we wanted to be doing was creating a demonstrator that just added to the already congested field of organisations looking to build digital twin style systems. Long-term decarbonisation is clearly a very broad target to hit. And so when thinking about how we may achieve this, we broke it down to a few target areas that would basically allow us to better identify the stakeholders that we'd need to actively engage with, and also determine which data sets would be necessary to input into a digital twin system to gain both dynamic outputs, but also to etch out the path for long-term decarbonisation. So we chose the focus areas here of better planning of low carbon solutions, energy flexibility modelling, and energy storage modelling, with the use cases on the screen being the more granular versions of these. So breaking these down into the following categories of time, geography, coverage, and dynamism, this allowed us to also compare these to the current suite of models and twins that already exist, and just ensured we were filling the gaps that currently exist within the energy sector. We obviously know that for any successful digital twin programme, the active and ongoing stakeholder engagement is crucial. And so we have been building and will continue to develop through hopefully a demonstrator phase, a strong benefits case as to what these technologies can offer. There are already so many organisations constructing their own digital twins, but we now need to put the onus on the sharing of information, the collaboration of workings, and most importantly, the dissemination of findings. There needs to be the correct incentives in place that shows that digital twin technologies are the solution to many of the energy system's problems, and these use cases should be able to offer benefits to everybody involved in the energy system lifecycle, from the planners to the policymakers to the engineers. So this brings us on to our final point. We are now about to publish our findings of the scope of works, where we've made a proposal for options for a demonstrator phase. We've suggested that there are two quite clear options, either a digital twin of a smaller geographic area, which is able to incorporate and model many different assets to show how it may be able to decarbonise as we move towards 2050, or an asset-specific digital twin, which is able to demonstrate the benefits of a digital twin using data that we already know exists in the granularity required. Arguably, the second option would be the most straightforward, as it would potentially require less data and would include more specific, easily identifiable stakeholders. But there then comes the challenge of when we look to scale this up into a national system, it could be tricky to do so. Having communicated with members of the Digital Twin Symposium group, there was a general consensus that a more localised demonstrator would be the most beneficial, as it would not only give the opportunity to create a twin, but it would also allow for parallel investigation into which data sets are currently available and which ones would need unlocking to achieve the desired benefits. One of the key aspects, and I suppose big advantages of a localised twin demonstrator that focuses on a smaller geographic area, is that we are able to quite easily incorporate and demonstrate behaviours of aligning industries, such as utilities and transport, that when we look to decarbonise are going to need to be in alignment with the energy system modelling anyway. So it would be more straightforward to incorporate those with a smaller geographic area. We are currently ironing out the options for next steps with the bays, but there is a strong likelihood that we'll be looking to start a demonstrator project in the coming months, with the output of an MVP digital twin proposal by the end of the project. So we welcome all opinions on the paper and offers to want to collaborate on this upcoming piece of work. And we're really looking forward to seeing some of the ideas that people put forward. And with that, I suggest we now move on to the panel discussion and questions. My email's on the slide. If people wanted to just drop me an email about how they wanted to collaborate in the coming kind of weeks and months. And yeah, we're going to welcome questions now. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and then I'm going to introduce the panel. So I suggest we start with Jonathan Berry.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm John Berry, the Data and Digitalisation Manager at Western Power Distribution. If people aren't sure who they are, they're the electricity distribution network operator in the East and West Midlands, South West and South Wales. And yeah, so very briefly, my role sort of encompasses the data models, data architecture, sort of quality, completeness and transparency, and improving the sort of process, people and technology internally and externally to make sure we deliver efficient and effective networks for now and moving it out to 2050. And that's you know, a huge part of this is having the right data in the right place at the right time for the right people, both for our staff and externally as well. And I sometimes think digital twin is a bit of a misnomer in its traditional terms of what's needed for the electricity and the energy industry in terms of a full real-time sort of two-way feed back, and maybe some of the work that Emily spoke about and the digital shadow is more appropriate in some terms. I think our information is very complex and each different user perhaps doesn't need all of that information, or we've got some examples of integrating our master data management systems with outputs to the common information model, for example, which is offline, but as well as an online solution for our network management system. So they're just a couple of examples. So yeah, I'm really keen to understand what people's questions are, and if people share my view and understanding, and perhaps dig a little bit more into what we've done as WPD and the wider energy industry through our members group ENA as well. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thank you. We move on to Chris Dent.
Good morning, everyone. So my name's Chris Dent. I'm Professor of Industrial Mathematics at the University of Edinburgh and a Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. And in the Edinburgh maths context, industrial maths simply means that to be eligible to apply for the job in 2016, I had to have had some effects on the world outside academia. Among other activity, I work with various people in the energy industry on algorithms for system operation and modelling for decision support in planning and policy, and with the National Digital Twin Programme on demonstration of some technology that they have developed. So I'd like to discuss in the panel the use of digital twins and other models for decision support. It's something of a truism to say that for any given application and specific decision question, we simply need to do what is required. And it's important not to get caught up in debates over exactly what is and is not a digital twin. And as I think Emily was saying, it's very important not to get caught up in an idea that digital twin is fundamentally better than not digital twin. But clearly it is important to make use of the new analytical and control technologies that are that are emerging from the digital twin agenda where that's going to be relevant. There are also big differences between operational and planning decisions in terms of use of digital twins, taking definitions of digital twin from the Energy Systems Catapult and the National Digital Twin Programme. So in operations, one typically has real-time monitoring and near real-time communication of instructions, and arguably parts of existing transmission system management setups, for instance, could be called digital twins for that reason, even though people typically don't. But this is definitely not the case in planning, where one is using data offline and it takes years to get feedback on consequences of decisions. So people vary as to whether such planning decision support can be included under the banner of digital twin, and typically the answer to that would depend on how one defines feedback within any definition of digital twin. Again, one's getting into these, can get into these slightly semantic arguments that don't really matter in many cases. So I look forward to the discussion and exploring more of these questions in the next half hour.
Amazing, thank you, Chris. And yeah, we'll introduce Sarah now.
Hi there, I'm Sarah Hayes. I'm the outreach lead for the National Digital Twin Programme, and I led the team that produced the report Data for the Public Good, which was published by the National Infrastructure Commission back in 2017. And it set the vision for a national digital twin and outlined the need for an information management framework to enable the secure, resilient information sharing across organisational and sectoral boundaries. So the National Digital Twin is not one big model of everything, it's an ecosystem of connected digital twins. And the energy sector is part of that ecosystem, but obviously a major part, which needs to be interconnected with the rest of the infrastructure system. So an energy system twin would be an ecosystem of connected energy digital twins. But it's the connections there that are really important. So we really need a framework to enable these connections between digital twins and the sharing of data in a principled, scalable way. And that's what we're doing in the National Digital Twin Programme, is building out this framework for sharing data. It's not just a technical framework, it's a socio-technical change programme to enable us to get more out of our data across infrastructure and the built environment. And as Chris mentioned, we're developing a demonstrator project working to share data across energy, water and telecoms to increase resilience across the infrastructure system and to demonstrate that it is possible to share data in this way. So I think this is an excellent paper, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and some questions today.
Amazing, thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to suggest we start our discussion with some of the areas around what do you all think, having worked with digital twins in a variety of different ways, the biggest blockers are to achieving a holistic energy system digital twin. And if we start with Jonathan on this one.
Yeah, I think I guess there's two bits for me, sort of selfishly, in terms of the electricity parts feeding into the wider energy ecosystem, is I guess looking in and looking out. So I guess from us looking in, historically we have needed lots of data to operate our network efficiently and effectively. There's been almost an exponential change through DSO functions and others in the electricity industry, which has meant we need to rapidly grow the amount of data we capture from the grid edge, as well as how we manage and store data internally. And I think that's a big one for us, is having the data in the right architecture, models and structure that we need to facilitate these, that were perhaps not needed before as an organization. And I think looking outwards for us is not really the owners of the data, but the custodians of the data, has been a regulated monopoly. Really is understanding the needs of those customers and stakeholders and the varying needs to make sure they are accessible for all. And that's really cuts across all my data program and portfolio, is what data have we got and how are we going to present it in the best way for an end user to drive value out of it. And I think that's been an interesting one for us. Is one of the real challenges, and does that mean you end up with sacrificing some of the capability of a system to make it suitable for all, or do you have different depths and different complexities? And then does that cause some confusion that you have sort of version A, B, and C depending on skill type, and that becomes a very interesting thing for people. So I think they're two of the big things for us. We've done lots of work around our data users and user personas and trying to model what people want and what they expect, as well as hugely investing in the data structure models architecture, as well as the data we capture to facilitate those either digital shadows or digital twins for our ADMS network control solutions. So I think they're two of the big things for us that we sort of sit in the middle of that, or I sit in the middle of that as the data manager in WPD to facilitate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes the biggest problem is that everyone gets a bit caught up in the word digital in digital twins and forgets about the data elements of it. And that brings us quite nicely on to Sarah, because I know a big part of the National Digital Twin Programme is developing the information management framework. So I suppose, does that look to solve a lot of the blockers of creating this holistic kind of twin system, in your opinion?
Yes, it does. And at the granular level, really to build upon what Jonathan said, it's about having a mature enough level of information management. So is your data in digital form, or is it on a paper copy in a cardboard box somewhere? And are you able to get the most out of your data and your information within the organisation? That's the very basis of this at the granular organizational level. But then at the national level, it's a question of, well, if it's useful to share data across organizations, having the right framework to do that is really what we're focused on in the National Digital Twin Programme, is building out that framework. It's not something that you can take off the shelf and say, here you go, here's that magic framework to share data across all sectors and organizations. It really needs to be built out. And that's a process really of what we're trying to do. And it's not just a technical framework for sharing data. There are all the sort of, other than the technical standards, there are the soft standards, but the sort of the means of sharing data, the cultural element as well is also really important.
Thank you. And Chris, again, the biggest blockers, obviously you do a lot of work within uncertainty modelling. I suppose the biggest thing we don't know about is low carbon tech and the impact it's going to have. Yeah. How do you foresee that playing out in the digital space?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions here is what we mean by holistic digital twin. Because Sarah's talked about the importance of sharing data in a clear and secure and resilient manner. The kind of modeling that one needs typically looks very different depending on what kind of application you have. So in very broad terms, as one goes to wider geographical scale, or is looking at planning decisions or policy decisions further into the future, one's going to be using much coarser grained modeling than if one's looking at real-time system operation, so I mean, one might base modelling for different purposes on different questions. But when you're looking at capital planning of long-term assets and looking at policy decisions, I mean, typically rather than ideas of high fidelity modelling, one would probably go to coarser grained modelling. Firstly, because there's simply not so much. There may simply be not so much point in some aspects in high fidelity modelling, because that can turn into just making stuff up when you're not sure what technologies will exist. But also, you've got a finite amount of computational ability typically, and one needs to on these longer term issues place a lot of emphasis on uncertainty treatment, exploring the different scenarios of what the future may throw at us in the future. So I think like everything, it's what one means by this and what the challenges are really comes from what the what the question that we're trying to answer is, and what information we have available, and what information and what information we have available in the sense of, say, hard data, and in what areas where when we're looking to the relatively far future, we're essentially having to provide data or uncertainty specifications through judgment calls.
Amazing. And I suppose that brings us quite nicely onto the question of, I suppose I've seen it in the chat box as well, of the question over who is going to be the kind of defined users of a system or of the data. But who do you foresee being the data owners within a digital twin system or digital twin style system, and who are going to be the data users? Because I think this is the question we're still looking to kind of etch out of who that's going to be, because I mean, ideally we foresee it being encompassing a wide variety of people who will both use and own data. But how do you foresee that kind of being separated as data owners and data users? And we'll come to Jonathan on this one.
Yeah, so my view is, you can't really transpose ownership and responsibility of data, and I think that all comes down to licensing arrangements of sharing this in the public view. I think of whether that's Creative Commons or other to augment it. It's about allowing people to be the sort of curators and users as they need. I think that's the big thing for me, as well as, I mentioned before about us trying to do some work about those user personas and really to understand what those users' needs are. I think that's also really important for us. And as I've said, we really just see ourselves, we are officially the data owners in a sort of defined data governance term, but we are really the custodians of our 8 million customers' data, and the responsibility for that as a utility, and that would be the same for any utility largely. And in the main, I think what really comes down to it is standard, and I think we're struggling with it within the electricity sector and the wider energy sector, is really defined standards, whether that's just the metadata and the dictionaries around it, glossaries and vocabularies, so it actually means the same thing to the same people. And what we don't actually end is in water, gas and electricity, everybody using the term capacity to mean 3 completely different things. And I think that's a huge bit, and I think it's not really too fussed about who owns it. It's about how we describe it and how we make it clear for those end users, so that even if we need different scales of density and complexity in models and digital twins, that the right end user at least understands what they are being given, so they can maximize the value out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Sarah had something to add on to that point.
Well, I mean, that's music to my ears, Jonathan, really, because what you're describing there is what we're trying to do within the information management framework, is create that common language for sharing data across sectors and across organisations. And I think, sort of in answer to the question, it really is, if you're the asset owner, you own the data, but then with that comes some responsibility for providing high quality data and ensuring it is suitable to be shared in the right way. But I think it could be helpful to think about an example here. So if we think of the EV charging network, if we were to have a digital twin of the EV charging network, something that we talk about in the toolkit, which you mentioned in your presentation, Emily, which is on the Digital Twin Hub, is the different use cases, what's it for? So if you have a digital twin of the EV charging network for a strategy planning perspective, you want to plan out the network, then you're, who are you looking at there? It's sort of, the network planners, aren't you? How does it fit with the rest of the transport infrastructure? That's sort of that big picture view. And it really is, it's the policymakers, it's the people in charge of actually setting out the networks and planning them. If you think about it from the managing assets point of view, if you're owning specific EV charging points, you are managing those assets. You need the data, the digital twins of the EV charging points to be able to manage the sort of the efficiency of those assets and make sure they're running as you want. The other perspective there is if you're looking at it from a resilience point of view, being able to manage the network as a whole, who's actually thinking about that. And then from a user perspective, if you've got an app on your phone, ultimately all that data could feed through to the app on your phone, which tells you, okay, where's your nearest charging point? You know, how long might you have to wait for it? How long is it going to take you to charge your car? So, I think it really, the idea of energy sector system digital twins will trickle through to absolutely everyone, and enable people. It's really about people having better information to make whatever decision it is that they need to make.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I've seen as well, so much of it depends on the unlocking of data. And this goes back to Jonathan's point about the appropriate licensing and standards needing to be put in place to protect, obviously, both the data subjects. And again, this has been raised in the chat too, and something we've had to think a lot about, especially when considering things like how digital twins are almost definitely going to need to incorporate things like smart meter data. How do you foresee kind of the data subjects being protected in this case to ensure that we're still getting a high quality of data sets, but I suppose aggregated to a point where it's still going to be usable? And how has that kind of played out on the national digital twin stuff that you've been doing, Sarah?
So it's really about having this framework to set the standards, to put the right protections in place for who owns the data, how the quality is ensured, how it's protected, how it's shared. It does come down to standards, technical standards, but then cultural practices. I think the Energy Data Task Force has done an awful lot, and the report that's being published following that done an awful lot to promote the idea of presumed open, and that is really beneficial. And I think it's moved the energy industry ahead of the telecoms industry. My background is in telecoms. It's a more sort of closed perspective within telecoms when it comes to data, and I really think the energy industry has moved ahead massively in the last few years here. But it's not just about presumed open, it's about interoperability. It's about being able to exchange data across organizations, having with the right kind of frameworks in place. And as I said, it's not just the technical side, it's the soft standards that as well that need to be in place. Yeah,
absolutely. Chris, I'm going to ask you a question from the chat.
Oh, well, I actually can I comment on that first, because I mean, well, I take presumed open to mean that essentially that in a sense that's the default, but there can still be good reasons why data would not be made open, and there are various reasons for that. What around, there could be customer privacy, could be genuine commercial sensitivity, could be national security reasons. And in particular, one of the, working with the Digital Twin programme, one of the points that we've come across is the national security issues around sharing data openly, and how in particular there are complications around where individual data sets might not in isolation be sensitive on security grounds, but when you combine different data sets, they can reveal things that are very helpful to bad people. So I think in terms of thinking broadly about open data and data sharing, there's obviously open data in the sense of data that anyone could download from the web, but I think it's also important to remember that another benefit of having the protocols for sharing data is the ability to share data robustly in confidence for particular purpose. And I can think of examples in work I've done where it would have been extremely helpful to have certain data in strict confidence, which for whatever reason hadn't been shared.
Absolutely. I suppose, Chris, the question that's come up in the chat box as well is, obviously in academia, you can do things quite easily like synthesize data sets and getting access to slightly more granular data. But how do you envisage those kind of models in academia being translated into the real world?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of issues here. I mean, first, I mean, I'll try. I was going to start off with a very glass half empty picture, but I'll try and turn it around and be a bit glass half full. I think what we really, I mean, there are huge benefits from having methods translated from academia into wide industry use and wide government use for the obvious reason. I mean, it's part of our role in academia is to do some of this deep thinking about methods that will be the deployable technologies of tomorrow, and we need to make sure all the right things are in place for that. I mean, one very important foundation is that to be doing research, for instance, we're calling energy system methodology research. It's not necessarily be the case. It's not necessarily the case that we need to be solving questions that were posed to us directly by industry, but one certainly needs to be aware of what real world questions are about, what real energy systems look like if you're going to call yourself an energy systems person. And then it's also very important that we have it's very important, therefore, that we have the right connections, so that academia is aware of of where future industry needs might be heading, and then that you have the research, development, deployment food chain properly joined up. But also another important part of that is skills, because one common matter, particularly as we're going through this quite rapid digitalisation change, is that there are a lot of practically very useful methods that have been developed that are in development, where these don't always map so neatly onto the skills base that currently exists in industry. So I think it's very important. I think it's very important that we don't see this as a research and innovation matter alone, but also think in terms of how this links to skills.
Absolutely. I'm going to go to the chat box to see if there's anything we've not covered. I've seen a question up quite frequently, which is examples of digital twin technologies. So how we can actually host a digital twin. And I think that's a question we've grappled with a little bit in the feasibility phase, and we look to kind of move on to doing a bit of a technology landscaping piece in the demonstrated bit. But I suppose, and some of the things we've come up against is that some of the modelling kind of software that exists isn't quite able to kind of incorporate the dynamic data flows that we need to, or incorporate kind of on a more granular level. Have you thought anything about which kind of software platforms we could use to host a twin system, which is able to kind of go onto that energy system, but also to inform policymakers and regulatory makers as well about decisions? And I suppose Chris is probably, and Sarah, I suppose, are the best ones to answer this question. So we go to Chris first.
Oh, I was hoping you weren't going to do that, because this isn't. This sounds really my department. I mean, my end of things is essentially one way of putting it is algorithms, as in things that you write down on paper. And I'm not a platforms person, so I'm definitive. So we would tend to I would tend to be involved in developing the relevant algorithms or statistical treatments in a sort of offline mode, and then I would work with other people for the actual implementation in control room or wherever. So I think I'll maybe Sarah and Jonathan are a better place to answer this one, says he, passing the buck.
Sure, I'm happy to take that one in that there are many platforms out there, and the best approach from government is to be platform agnostic. So to be able to develop a framework which is effectively will be a public good for everyone to use to share data. And then it's really up to you. If you're developing a digital twin, you go and find which is the best platform for you to have your digital twin hosted on. And that's, I guess the sort of the phrase that we use to describe that is collaborate on the rules. Let's all collaborate on producing these standards, soft and hard, this framework for sharing data so that we can compete on the game. And that really is part of competing on the game. So different platforms will offer different things.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to add that's the same thing about putting what data needs to look like, what the structures, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable is what's really key. I think looking internally in the electricity industry, the way we've built models before has been dictated by the end software solution that we have used, and that's driven us to have our data structure and data models in certain ways, and that has created a level of additional work. Now we need to share them in a standard open common format, so people don't need to be able to use that same software, and I think that's what we need to go forwards. And computing power is there, right? It's just platforms are going to be available. It's making sure the people developing those understand what the data means and what the rules around it are, I think.
Yeah, we talk about open data, open software.
And how do I suppose the biggest question is, and obviously we've spoken a lot about presumed open, and that's now been included in the kind of RIIO-2 bits. But how do we continue to incentivize the opening up of data whilst also really honing in on the security and privacy elements? I know I've seen a lot with the smart meter rollout. You just have to Google smart meters to have a wave of negative things come up against them, which obviously when a consumer looks at isn't that attractive. So how do we push both, I suppose, the organisations to convey the positive message of opening up information and ensure that security is really ticked off, I suppose?
I think if I can jump in first there, I think it really, this boils down to having the right information available at the right time to make the decision, and and the right person using that information, and it's of the right quality. That's what it's all about here, and that it sort of encompasses the security point as well. So for organisations, I think the incentive really is, of course, you want to have the right information available to make the best decisions, because it's going to improve the outcomes for your business. But I think there's an organisational perspective, but I think there's sort of a bigger picture societal perspective here, isn't it? When we're tackling climate change, I think the people here, we all have a sort of a duty to explore how digital twins can help us tackle climate change and help us make the right decisions. And I think as firms start to recognise the actions that they need to take in that space, it becomes imperative from a sustainability perspective to stay in the market, that they have to start working in this way. So I think it isn't just about, oh, look at us, we're opening up our data, aren't we good? It's, actually we've got to do it, but we're going to do it in a secure way according to the rules that we've agreed with everyone else. And really ultimately there's a benefit for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's Emily, you mentioned RIIO-2, so our business planning work is well underway. I think it'll be released next week, the first full-ish version for 23 to 28, and I think that's the Energy Data Task Force report that came out and presumed open. That us and other DNOs and utilities, that has really changed us from thinking, someone's asked for that, why would we share it, to genuinely question in our data sets to say what would stop us from sharing this. And I think that was the point that was raised before, linking that to some of the NIS activity around the security and sharing of data. I think I just saw something pop up around the security of operational data that hugely comes into it, and it's about the standardization of data triage and governance processes to effectively facilitate that. I think one of the being regulated, one of the easiest ways to do that is for BEIS to determine a policy and Ofgem ensure that policy and process is implemented, and there's a carrot and stick approach to that with any regulated business that can say it needs to be done. I think one of the biggest interests and challenges for us is where we have made where we have data internally and we look to assess the quality and the completeness to share it externally. It's where actually some of that data that we don't use it internally currently, we need to look and sharing externally, where there's a, you know, there's a platform, a maintenance, a quality cost to go for it, which is, you know, sort of leaning back on Sarah's bit, we all have a duty to, you know, look at developing digital twins to see what can be come back. I think the return on investment essentially for the multitude of parties investing on sharing data, maintaining it, keeping it secure and safe to facilitate the what can we do with this, I think is a really interesting challenge. I think I'm sure there's lots of papers around the return on investment and the CBA of digital twins, but I think concentrating on some specific use cases, and I think Sarah gave the EV one, and I think that's a real good one. I like the idea of, you know, EVs, electricity and transport mixing, and the need for a digital twin that in real time understanding transport flow, so we can understand how our energy needs to flow for charging routes and things. I think that's a real tangible example, and I think the more of those we can have, the greater propensity of open data there's going to be, because once the use case is there, we can see the CBA and the sort of ROI for not for us as a business, but, you know, GB PLC, I guess, is what's really important.
Cool, amazing. Well, conscious of time, I'm going to suggest any questions in the box we've not quite covered, we will seek to reply to those by email after this. My email was on the slides, but I can drop it into the chat box as well if anybody hasn't quite got access to that. But thank you so much, obviously Jonathan, Chris and Sarah, for joining today. I really hope it was useful to everyone that's joined, and hopefully we've managed to answer a lot of questions, and hopefully incite some really great discussion. And if anybody wants to kind of look to collaborate in the near future, please don't hesitate to contact any of us, so myself or Simon as well, who introduced the call earlier. And yeah, I suggest we finish it there. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, hope to chat some more about digital twins in the near future.
Indeed. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.